It was December of the year 1936 when a trembling voice echoed across the wireless of Britain. Edward, newly crowned yet already burdened, spoke of a love he could not renounce. His words, clear yet shadowed with sorrow, told the nation that he would lay aside the weight of crown and kingdom, for he could not reign without the woman he cherished. In that moment, an unseen figure, an American woman named Wallis, shifted the course of monarchy itself. Her presence was absent from the broadcast, yet her name filled every pause, every silence. The crown, so ancient and unyielding, bent beneath the touch of love. Welcome, dear listener, to this tale carried across time. Share with us when and where you are listening, becoming part of this great circle of memory. And if you wish to keep such voices alive, remember to subscribe and continue our wandering through timeless stories. In Baltimore, in the winter of 1896, the air was sharp with cold, and the Warfield family faced a moment of both joy and grief. For on the 19th day of June, a child entered the world, and scarcely had her cries filled the room before fate's cruelty was revealed. Her father, Teakle Wallace Warfield, weakened by illness, would soon depart this life, leaving his infant daughter, Bessie Wallace, and her mother to tread a path uncertain. A child's first breath met with death's shadow, a mingling of beginnings and endings that would mark her life with an air of unsettled destiny. The city of Baltimore in those years was a place of both gentility and struggle, with streets lined by red brick houses and parlors heavy with drapery and family pride. Yet behind the lace curtains, the Warfields bore the quiet mark of decline. Once a family of social standing, their fortunes had withered. Wallace's mother, Alice, carried herself with grace, but bore the burden of scant means. Widowed and left to raise her daughter, she relied on the generosity of kin. And kin, as the listener may know, can give with one hand and remind of debt with the other. So it was that the child grew within an atmosphere of dependence and striving, always aware of what was withheld as much as what was given. Did she, even as a girl, sense the need to charm, to win favor, to survive through wit where fortune had failed? We cannot know, but one imagines the child's dark eyes observing the smallest gestures, learning the subtle power of presence long before she could name it. In her earliest years, the little girl was not known as Wallis, but by the affectionate family name of Bessie. Yet she herself refused the sound of it, and by stubborn will insisted on being called Wallis. It is a curious act for a child to shape one's name as if already declaring independence from the world's designs. From such small beginnings, the pattern of her life can be traced, the refusal to be diminished, the reshaping of self through deliberate insistence. Her days were a blend of genteel appearances and quiet insecurity. Baltimore society, though polite, carried sharp edges of distinction. A family's name might open doors, but whispers of financial decline could close them just as swiftly. The young girl, in her neatly kept clothes and careful manners, learned to walk among these fragile thresholds, never fully secure, never fully excluded. To live on the edge of belonging is to sharpen the mind, to quicken the senses, to observe with care the small rituals by which acceptance is granted or denied. And so she watched. She observed how voices lowered in greeting, how a smile might conceal disdain, how the weight of a hand upon a shoulder might bestow or withhold favor. She was not born into wealth, but into perception. Her strength would lie in reading the unspoken language of society, a language that in time would carry her into the highest of circles and the deepest of scandals. Her mother's devotion was constant, though perhaps tinted with the quiet desperation of one who knew their position was precarious. Alice Warfield lived with dignity, but her daughter would have seen the subtle humiliations, the need to accept charity, the soft refusals of those unwilling to extend too much. did these moments plant in Wallis the hunger not only to belong, but to command attention, to secure a place so high it could not be questioned? There were days of sunlight, too, days when the little girl played in gardens, when the scent of lilac filled the spring air, when laughter momentarily drowned out worry. Memory, like history, is not only sorrow but fragments of sweetness, and it is within such contrasts that character is formed. The child of Baltimore knew both want and grace, both exclusion and promise, and in this mingling a seed of ambition took root. Her schooling was respectable, if not extraordinary. At Oldfield School, a place designed for young women of society, she refined her manners and her speech. Teachers noted her sharp mind, her lively wit, and her determination to stand out. Among companions, she was often the one to guide the rhythm of conversation, to set the tone of laughter. She did not possess classic beauty, yet there was something undeniable about her presence, a magnetism that others recognized. It is said that charm is the ability to make others forget your weaknesses, and perhaps Wallis, even then, mastered such an art. But childhood is never only outward display. Within her must have grown the quiet awareness that fortune was fragile, that security could slip like water through the hand. This knowledge, carried from girlhood into adulthood, might explain why she sought stability not through wealth alone, but through connection, through alignment with those whose positions seemed immovable. To marry well, to secure herself within society's embrace, this was not simply vanity but survival shaped into elegance. And yet, was there also a spirit of defiance within her, a refusal to accept the fate of dependence? Some have said she sought power deliberately, calculating each step. Others believe she was swept along, her choices half made for her by circumstance. Perhaps the truth lies in the tension between these views, for are we not all both shaped by the world and shaping it in turn? The Baltimore of her youth, with its drawing rooms and whispered judgments, was but a small stage. Yet it was upon this stage that Wallis first rehearsed the roles she would later perform before kings and nations. The girl who corrected her name, who demanded to be addressed not as Bessie but as Wallis, was already preparing to stand against the world's dismissals. And so, her childhood years passed, marked by the interplay of ambition and insecurity, charm and calculation, grace and uncertainty. Each memory, each whispered slight, each fleeting triumph contributed to the formation of a woman who would one day stand at the heart of the greatest crisis the British crown had endured in modern times. The scent of lilacs fades, the echo of Baltimore voices recedes, and the young woman prepares to step into a wider world. Yet even as she takes her first steps beyond childhood, the shadow of loss remains behind her. The absence of a father shaping the presence of desire, of longing, of ambition. The story pauses here, with the image of a young girl standing in the doorway of possibility, her eyes already searching for something beyond the horizon. The doorway of possibility stood before her, its frame neither gilded nor grand, but filled with the uncertain light of a new century. As Wallis passed from childhood into young womanhood, she carried with her both the memories of narrow Baltimore parlors and the restless curiosity of one who yearned for more. The scent of lilacs lingered faintly in her mind, yet beyond that fragrance was a hunger she could scarcely name. The world was wider than the drawing rooms she had known, and she longed to walk through it not as a guest tolerated by others' charity, but as one who commanded her own place. In those early years, Wallis revealed herself as a restless spirit. At school, her sharp tongue and keen wit made her stand apart. Companions spoke of her ability to charm or unsettle with equal ease. She could draw laughter from a group, yet her words carried a precision that sometimes wounded. The teachers noted that she was clever, though not always diligent, and it seemed her ambition was less for books than for life itself. What she absorbed most keenly were not the lessons written on paper, but those acted out in posture, tone, and gesture, the subtle grammar of society that determined who led and who followed. There are those who, from childhood, feel themselves destined for a stage larger than the one allotted to them. Did Wallis sense such a fate stirring within her? It is tempting to believe so, for her choices, even in youth, were shaped by an instinct to move beyond the limits imposed upon her. She learned quickly that beauty alone would not suffice, for she was not blessed with the features that magazines exalted. Instead, she cultivated style, poise, and the art of command through presence, to be looked at not with pity, not with indulgence, but with admiration. That became her subtle aim. Baltimore, though a city of some elegance, could not long contain her spirit. The society there, built upon tradition and memory of families' fortunes, offered few pathways for one whose name no longer carried wealth. In gatherings, Wallis observed how older women rehearsed the same rituals, how men spoke in circles of power and business. She found the rhythms predictable, the opportunities narrow. Yet within this restlessness, a deeper truth stirred. She would not be satisfied with comfort alone. She sought something that shimmered just out of reach, something that promised freedom as much as security. In her youth, she traveled occasionally with her mother, journeys that widened her view beyond the familiar streets of Maryland. Each new place stirred her imagination. She was quick to notice the different manners of speech, the styles of dress, the shifting codes of etiquette. Where others might have seen only novelty, she saw lessons. These journeys planted the seed of adaptability within her, a skill that in time would serve her with remarkable effect. For what is charm, if not the ability to reflect to others what they wish to see while concealing what one wishes to hide? The memory of her father's absence never left her. Though she had been too young to truly know him, the knowledge that she was fatherless weighed heavily. In a society where men held the power of name and fortune, she and her mother moved in borrowed spaces. From this absence arose in her both a vulnerability and a strength. Vulnerability because she feared exclusion, strength because she learned to stand without the shield of a patriarch's protection. Perhaps this duality explains why throughout her life she would simultaneously seek male protection and resist its domination. She wished to be cherished, yet never controlled. Among friends, she began to cultivate her persona. She dressed with a flair that outshone her means, often arranging garments to appear more costly than they were. Accessories, chosen carefully, lent an air of distinction. She carried herself upright, shoulders poised, chin lifted slightly higher than fashion dictated. This posture, once noted, became part of her signature presence, a woman who seemed always a little taller than she was, a little more certain than she felt. To walk into a room with such bearing was to command attention without demanding it. There are recollections of her voice, low and deliberate, with a trace of amusement even in the most casual remarks. Voices, after all, can enchant or repel, and she used hers like an instrument. A question from her lips could sound like an invitation or a challenge. Did she understand, even then, the power of tone over words? Perhaps she did, for she seemed to relish not only speaking but listening, guiding the flow of conversation with subtle cues, letting others reveal more than they intended. As adolescence turned to early womanhood, suitors appeared. Some were drawn by her wit, others by her intriguing presence. Yet few remained long. It is said that Wallis was exacting, unwilling to settle for what did not suit her vision of life. She wished for companionship, but more than that, she wished for advancement. Love, in the sense of surrender, did not seem her nature. Instead, she sought union with someone who might provide her not only affection, but access to places and lives beyond her reach. Was this calculation, or merely the survival instinct of a woman who had grown up with little? We cannot say for certain, and perhaps she herself did not distinguish clearly between ambition and desire. The young Wallis, as she moved within the small circles of Baltimore and beyond, began to see her future not as something given, but as something to be seized. And yet beneath the confidence she displayed, there must have been moments of doubt. At night, when mirrors reflect not the image crafted for others, but the face unadorned, did she ask herself whether she could truly rise above the limitations set upon her? Such questions, unspoken, shape the restlessness that drives us forward. By the early years of the new century, whispers of change filled the air. The world itself was shifting, with inventions altering daily life, with new freedoms stirring in women's movements, with the old structures of society beginning to tremble. Wallis, still in the innocence of youth, stood at the edge of these changes, her gaze fixed not backward but forward. The lilac-scented gardens of Baltimore were behind her. Ahead lay paths that would take her far from the place of her birth. One can imagine her standing at the threshold of adulthood, the glow of a summer evening casting shadows on the walls, her thoughts drifting toward possibilities unformed. Was she already envisioning a life beyond America, or did destiny surprise her only later? The uncertainty of that moment lingers, like the pause before a journey begins. The door of childhood closed quietly behind her, and before her stretched the long corridor of experience. Soon she would make choices that bound her to others, choices that would shape not only her own life but the course of history itself. But for now, she stood restless, alert, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. And just as the last light of day faded from the Baltimore streets, she prepared to step into marriage, the first of her ventures into the complex dance between desire and destiny. The fading light of Baltimore evenings closed upon her youth, and before her opened the uncertain dawn of marriage. The decision seemed to her at once a promise of stability and a venture into a wider world. And so in 1916 she bound her name and fate to that of Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a naval aviator of the United States Navy. To those around her it appeared a good match. A young woman of social ambition joined to a man whose uniform carried authority and adventure. Yet beneath the surface of ceremony and congratulations, shadows gathered, for the path she chose would soon reveal itself as one of turbulence rather than security. Spencer was a man of charm in public, quick with words and gestures that impressed, but behind closed doors he bore the restless habits of drink and temper. For Wallis, eager to find in him the protector and provider she had lacked since childhood, the reality proved starkly different from her expectations. The household she entered was not one of gentle harmony but of quarrels, long absences, and an uneasy solitude. Nights stretched into mornings with the sound of footsteps unsteady on the stairs, the scent of alcohol lingering where laughter should have been. She endured as many women of her era did, presenting a composed face to the world while concealing the disarray of her private sphere. Yet within her a resolve began to strengthen. She would not, she could not let her life be consumed by disappointment. From the ashes of unrest she drew a new determination to shape her circumstances rather than surrender to them. The lessons of childhood had taught her resilience, and now that resilience took on sharper form. In those years, she accompanied Spencer on postings abroad, most notably to Asia. It was in China that her horizons broadened in ways neither she nor others could have foreseen. While her marriage faltered, her mind and imagination were fed by the unfamiliar. The streets of Peking, with their winding alleys, markets alive with color, and temples heavy with incense, offered her both distraction and revelation. She studied fragments of language, observed rituals, alien yet compelling, and listened to whispers of traditions older than the lands she had known. Some accounts suggest she encountered circles interested in mysticism, in practices of the body and spirit that seemed to promise transformation. Whether these stories are embroidered by gossip or rooted in truth, it is certain that her time in Asia left upon her a mark of intrigue. She absorbed the air of difference, and with it came a new layer of mystery to her persona. Returning to America or Europe, she would speak of these experiences with a knowing tone, her stories flavored by the exotic, setting her apart from women whose travels had been more modest. In this way, even disappointment in marriage furnished her with tools to craft her image. But life with Spencer did not improve. His drinking worsened and quarrels grew sharper. She found herself often alone, forced to rely on her own company and resources. Loneliness, however, has a curious alchemy. It can break the spirit or deepen the well of self-reliance. For Wallis, it seemed to do both at once. She suffered the ache of neglect, yet she also honed her ability to survive. She learned to smile when weary, to host when empty, to present herself with dignity even when her private world trembled. One wonders, as one gazes back upon these years, what thoughts filled her long, solitary evenings. Did she question her choices, lamenting the husband she had chosen? Or did she quietly plot her next steps, knowing this marriage could not hold her forever? Perhaps both. Perhaps the very tension between resignation and ambition created the restless energy that would propel her forward. By 1927, after more than a decade of turbulence, she obtained a divorce. In a society still slow to accept such separations, the act was bold, even scandalous. Yet she did not retreat into shame. Instead, she emerged with a sharpened sense of self, as if the fire of disappointment had forged in her a harder steel. Divorce did not diminish her. It marked her as a woman willing to cut ties when they no longer served her survival or her growth. Her first marriage, then, was not only a chapter of personal sorrow, but also a crucible in which her resilience was tested and tempered. It revealed to her the frailty of illusions, the danger of placing one's future wholly in another's hands, and the necessity of cultivating one's own strength. And though she may have longed for stability, she also discovered that within the fractures of disappointment lay the possibility of reinvention. It is worth asking, had her first husband been a man of steady habits, of kindness and constancy, would Wallis have become the figure history remembers? Or would she have remained an obscure wife, living quietly within the boundaries of ordinary society? Destiny often arrives in disguise, and sometimes misfortune provides the very stage upon which a greater drama unfolds. Her life with Spencer ended not with dramatic finality, but with the quiet signing of papers, the slow disentangling of two incompatible lives. Yet the silence that followed was filled with a kind of anticipation. Wallis, no longer bound to the turbulence of a failing union, stood once more at the edge of possibility. She had passed through the fire and carried its scars, but also its hard-earned wisdom. And as the doors of her first marriage closed, she found herself gazing again toward horizons not yet reached. The lilacs of Baltimore were distant, the quarrels of Spencer receding echoes. Ahead lay a chance to fashion herself anew, to step once more into society with an air not of defeat, but of transformation. The sound of quarrels fades, the heavy steps of a drunken husband dissolve into memory, and in their place rises the distant murmur of a new city, a new gathering, a new chance to reimagine herself. It was in the quiet aftermath of divorce that Wallis prepared for her next chapter, one that would bring her closer to the circles of wealth and influence she had long observed from afar. And so the story turns toward reinvention, where a woman who had been wounded by disappointment began to stitch together a life of elegance, determination, and ambition, readying herself for the steps that would carry her into the heart of scandal and into the very annals of history. The distant murmur of reinvention rose around her like the soft hum of a new city. Yet before she could fully claim her next life, the memories of her travels in Asia returned with insistent weight. They clung to her, like the faint fragrance of incense carried on garments long after one has left the temple. These journeys, begun during her marriage to Spencer and deepened in the restless years after, had woven into her being a sense of the world's vastness, its mysteries, and its endless variety of masks. In China, she had walked through streets alive with colors her Baltimore eyes had never known. Vermilion gates, golden roofs gleaming under a hazy sun, the crisp sounds of vendors calling their wares, the scent of spices and unfamiliar smoke curling into the air. All of it seemed to her at once chaotic and ordered, as if the life of that land followed laws she could not yet name. She studied it with curiosity, storing each impression as if these fragments would one day serve her in places far removed from Peking's old alleys. It is said she dabbled in the language, repeating syllables until they formed tentative bridges into a culture both inviting and closed. Some whispered that she ventured into practices of the body and spirit, that she sought knowledge hidden from the casual traveler. Whether these tales are embroidered by gossip or preserved in truth, one cannot deny that something in those years marked her. When she later spoke of them, it was with a tone that hinted at secrets known and concealed. Her reputation, already touched by the scandal of divorce, grew further shaded by the aura of the exotic. And in the salons of Europe, where novelty was a currency, such shades only deepened her allure. The rituals she observed fascinated her. The careful ceremony of tea, the deliberate movement of hands and eyes, the way respect was conveyed not by words but by gestures. These struck her keenly, for Wallis had always been attuned to the unspoken language of society, and here she found a confirmation that such codes were not trivial but essential. Later, in rooms where every glance mattered, she would recall these lessons: to move with purpose, to bow ever so slightly, to pause in silence rather than rush to speech. These became part of her art, born not from books, but from lived observation. Her loneliness during those travels cannot be ignored. Though surrounded by new sights, she remained tethered to a marriage that drained rather than nourished. Spencer's absences, his habits, his indifference left her to wander through foreign streets with little more than her own determination for company. Yet solitude in a distant land can act as a teacher. Alone, she listened more closely, saw more sharply, felt more deeply. The ache of neglect intertwined with the fascination of discovery, and together they shaped her into a woman, both wounded and resilient, both skeptical and intrigued by the world's possibilities. She learned the art of survival in more ways than one. Money was never abundant, and she became skilled at stretching means while presenting abundance. Dresses altered with skillful hands appeared as if tailored anew. Jewelry worn with confidence gleamed more brightly than its worth. She turned necessity into style, and style into influence. To others, she seemed a woman of poise and elegance, while beneath the surface lay the calculation of one who knew the cost of every gesture. Was this deception, or was it artistry? Perhaps both. Perhaps the line between them vanishes when one's very survival depends upon the illusion of ease. There are stories, too, of her mingling with foreign officers, of friendships that hovered near impropriety. Yet such tales are often born of suspicion rather than fact. What is certain is that Wallis became skilled at drawing attention, at creating the sense that she was not to be overlooked. Even those who disliked her found it difficult to ignore her. And in the labyrinth of gossip that circled her life, every rumor, whether cruel or admiring, served only to enlarge her presence. Upon returning from Asia, she carried these experiences like jewels, hidden in the folds of memory. They gave her an advantage in the drawing rooms of Europe, for she could speak with an authority rare among women of her class. While others recounted domestic matters, she told of ceremonies in Peking, of temples echoing with gongs, of markets alive with silks and spices. Her words transported listeners, and though they could not verify every detail, they leaned closer, intrigued by the image she painted of herself as worldly and knowing. Did she believe herself transformed by those years, or was transformation merely the image she projected? The question remains unanswered, for transformation is a thing both internal and external. One becomes who one pretends to be, and Wallis, by pretending to be worldly, became so. Yet even as she polished this new self, traces of insecurity remained. She still feared exclusion, still sensed the fragility of her place. Behind the upright posture and sharp wit, there lingered the echo of the Baltimore child watching others with careful eyes. The strength of her performance was born from the memory of weakness. Her marriage to Spencer, already fraying, could not survive the weight of distance and disappointment. The divorce severed her from him, yet it did not sever her from the lessons she had drawn. From Asia, she carried not only stories, but a sharpened sense of adaptability, an awareness that identity could be reshaped like clay, molded to fit the contours of circumstance. And so she emerged from that chapter altered, both in truth and in perception. To some, she was a woman scarred by failure, wandering from one place to another. To others, she was a figure of intrigue, marked by experiences beyond the reach of ordinary lives. Both views contained fragments of truth, and both would follow her into the years ahead. She now faced the question of where to place herself in the next act of her life. America, with its memories of dependence and childhood struggles, offered little allure. Europe, with its ancient traditions and rigid hierarchies, beckoned with the promise of both challenge and opportunity. To walk into its drawing rooms as an American divorcée would not be easy, yet perhaps the very difficulty enticed her. For what greater triumph than to conquer the circles that seemed most closed? The sound of temple gongs fades, the scent of incense dissipates, and the memory of foreign streets gives way to the clipped voices of London society. Wallis, carrying her scars and her stories, stepped now into the world of reinvention, seeking a new beginning that would draw her closer to the highest stages of power. The whisper of mystery followed her, trailing like a silk scarf caught in the wind as she prepared to enter her second marriage. Not merely a bond of affection, but a deliberate step towards stability and influence. The silk scarf caught in the wind, whispering of mystery and unfinished journeys, drifted now into the corridors of reinvention. Divorce had released her from the burdens of Spencer, and though scars remained, they shimmered faintly beneath the polish of resilience. With every step she took, Wallis seemed determined to weave herself anew, as if fabricating from threads of failure and survival a garment of elegance that none could see through. And so she returned to America with the clarity of one who knew she must not falter, for hesitation would only expose the fragility of her situation. In the late 1920s, America itself was in flux. Prosperity had swollen to excess, and society bustled with parties, speculation, and glittering illusions. Yet even amidst this spirit of indulgence, the life of a divorced woman was precarious. Respectable families hesitated to extend invitations, whispers lingered behind closed doors, and men approached with curiosity but also caution. Wallis, however, moved with a new assurance. She had learned that if one could not belong by right, one might belong by performance. And so she carried herself with an elegance that belied her means, presenting a version of herself that seemed both untouchable and alluring. It was during this period of recalibration that she met Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American businessman whose wealth, though not extravagant, offered stability, and whose manner, though reserved, promised respectability. Their union, solemnized in 1928, was to many observers the perfect arrangement. She, a woman of charm and worldly air, lent sparkle to his somewhat staid demeanor. He, with his steady finances and British connections, provided her a foothold into circles she could not otherwise have entered. Marriage, for Wallis, was seldom a matter of simple affection. It was a stage upon which she could reassert herself, and this second attempt promised far greater success than the first. In earnest, she found not passion but companionship, and perhaps she believed for a time that this balance would suffice. He admired her wit, tolerated her sharpness, and seemed content to place her at his side as a decorative yet commanding presence. Their home, modestly grand, allowed her to practice the arts she valued most, hosting, arranging, and cultivating a sphere of influence through the careful orchestration of dinners and conversations. Guests left speaking less of the food than of the hostess, whose quick remarks and unerring eye for detail impressed upon them a sense of distinction. But beneath the veneer of domestic harmony, a question lingered. Was this enough? Wallis had endured disappointment before, and she had risen from it. Now, with security within her grasp, she seemed almost restless once again, for stability can soothe, but it can also stifle, and a woman who had glimpsed the vastness of Asia and the allure of foreign salons could not easily settle into the role of a comfortable wife. The desire for more, a hunger sharpened by childhood loss, by years of marginal belonging, still stirred. London became her new stage when the couple moved across the Atlantic. The shift from Baltimore parlors to British drawing rooms was immense, yet Wallis approached it with the same poise she had cultivated in every chapter of her life. She studied accents, refined her manner of speech, and absorbed the intricate hierarchies of class that governed English society. Americans were often regarded with a mixture of fascination and condescension, yet Wallis turned this to her advantage. Her difference made her memorable, and her wit, sharper than many expected, disarmed skepticism. Among the expatriate set, she quickly established herself as a hostess of note. Her dinners were small but carefully curated, her remarks bold yet never vulgar. Men were drawn to her cleverness, women intrigued by her style. She mastered the art of being slightly outrageous while never crossing into offense, of balancing intimacy with aloofness. She laughed readily, but her laughter often carried a note of irony, reminding her listeners that she saw more than she revealed. In this way, she positioned herself not as a supplicant seeking entry, but as a presence others were eager to include. Her appearance, too, evolved. Wallis was not conventionally beautiful, and she knew it. But she compensated with impeccable grooming, perfectly tailored clothes, and a daring sense of fashion that made her stand out. She favored sleek lines, bold accessories, and an elegance that suggested control. To look at her was to see a woman who had considered every detail, who permitted no accident in her presentation. Was it vanity, or was it a shield? Perhaps both, for in controlling how others saw her, she controlled the terms of her belonging. Ernest, for his part, seemed content. He admired her presence, and perhaps he enjoyed the social prominence she secured for them. But one wonders if he ever sensed the undercurrent of dissatisfaction in her. Did he see the flicker in her eyes when conversations dulled? The slight impatience in her tone when plans seemed small? If he did, he gave no sign, or else he chose to ignore it. For men of his station often valued peace over passion, and Wallis, though restless, maintained the facade of dutiful wife. Yet the world around them shifted. The late 1920s gave way to the dark shadow of economic collapse, and the glitter of prosperity dulled. Still, in the insulated circles of London society, rituals of elegance persisted, and it was within these circles that Wallis would encounter acquaintances who would alter her destiny beyond imagining. Through mutual friends, through dinners and salons, her path edged ever closer to that of Edward, Prince of Wales. But such encounters still lay ahead, faint outlines on the horizon of possibility. For now, she was still Mrs. Simpson, a woman who had carved for herself a place within the intricate tapestry of British society. The reinvention she had sought was nearly complete. From the fragile daughter of Baltimore to the neglected wife of a naval officer, from the lonely traveler in Asia to the polished hostess of London, Wallis had shaped herself again and again, each time more deliberate, more commanding. But reinvention is never an end in itself. It is a preparation for the next stage. And hers, though she could not yet know it, would entwine her fate with that of a king, drawing her from the margins into the center of history's stage. The sound of laughter in London drawing rooms mingles now with the faint echo of footsteps in royal corridors. The voice of an American hostess blends with the hush of courtiers, and the stage prepares itself for an encounter that would change the crown itself. The mingled laughter of London drawing rooms, softened by candlelight and perfumed air, gave way to a quieter rhythm in the home of Ernest and Wallis Simpson. Within those walls, respectability and stability appeared to reign, though behind the polished surfaces lay the ceaseless restlessness of a woman who had never been content with stillness. Ernest, ever the steady businessman, seemed satisfied with the life they had built together. A house in the right quarter, friends of the right standing, dinners of the proper sort. To him, marriage was a steady tide. To Wallis, it was another stage, another chance to shape her identity, though one that she already sensed might be too narrow for her spirit. Ernest admired his wife with genuine devotion. He admired her quick wit, her impeccable style, her ability to command a room with little more than a tilt of the head or a pointed remark. She, in turn, appreciated his steadiness, his willingness to provide a foundation upon which she might construct her persona. Yet affection, though present, never flamed into passion. Their marriage was not built on fire, but on form, and while form can hold for a time, it cannot always contain the deeper currents of human longing. Still, Wallis thrived in the life Ernest's name and resources afforded her. She moved through London society with a deliberate grace, neither too bold nor too timid. Her accent, still American, became less pronounced, softened by the cadences of her adopted world. She listened, observed, and learned the nuances of conversation and hierarchy until she could glide from circle to circle with an ease that seemed natural, though it had been carefully cultivated. She had once studied the codes of Baltimore parlors. Now she deciphered those of Mayfair. The lesson was the same. To belong is to master appearances. London's society of the interwar years was both dazzling and precarious. Behind its glamour lay political unrest, economic uncertainty, and the scars of the Great War. Yet within its drawing rooms, men and women still played out their rituals of conversation, gossip, and intrigue. Wallis found herself among expatriates and aristocrats, businessmen and courtiers, and with each gathering she refined her role. She became known not merely as Ernest's wife, but as a woman in her own right, quick with words and unafraid of daring remarks. Where many hostesses sought only to please, she relished the power of provocation, the laughter that follows a well-placed barb, the silence that signals she has unsettled the complacent. It was at such gatherings that her name began to move from one circle to another, whispered with admiration or disapproval, but never with indifference. To be noticed, to be spoken of, to linger in others' conversations, this was the currency she pursued. She had known invisibility in childhood, obscurity in her first marriage. Now she ensured that her presence was undeniable. And Ernest, though perhaps occasionally perplexed, seemed content to let her shine, proud that his wife's name carried such resonance. Yet there were moments, even amid her success, when Wallis felt the hollowness beneath the glitter. The dinners, the salons, the endless chatter. Did they truly satisfy the hunger that had driven her from Baltimore to Asia, from one marriage to another? Or were they only steps along a path she could not yet see? Restlessness stirred again within her, a quiet unease that no carefully arranged evening could dispel. She had secured a place, but she still sought a purpose. Among the British, she remained an outsider. Her accent marked her, her divorce shadowed her, and whispers of her past lingered like faint smoke. Yet paradoxically, it was this very otherness that set her apart, that gave her a lure in circles where familiarity often bred contempt. She was not bound by the same rules as those born into titles. She could speak more freely, laugh more boldly, dress with greater daring. The English, accustomed to restraint, found in her a vitality that both fascinated and unsettled them. And it was within this delicate balance, half accepted, half excluded, that her path drew nearer to the royal sphere. Friends of friends brought her closer to gatherings where the Prince of Wales himself might appear. Edward, heir to the throne, was already known for his charm, his restlessness, his discontent with the rigid duties of monarchy. Like Wallis, he seemed to crave something beyond the forms imposed upon him, and though their first meetings were casual, even unremarkable, the air carried the faint charge of inevitability. For Wallis, the prospect of royal acquaintance was not a calculated ambition so much as a natural extension of her climb. She had always sought circles of influence, always moved toward the center of power. To meet the prince was merely another step, though one whose significance she could scarcely have imagined in those early encounters. Still, there is a sense that she recognized in him a spirit not unlike her own, charming, restless, dissatisfied with the roles assigned. Two such souls, meeting across a crowded room, cannot help but draw toward one another, if only at first by curiosity. Ernest remained at her side, loyal and untroubled, unaware of how swiftly his wife's charm would capture the attention of a man whose name was known in every corner of the empire. Did Ernest sense the undercurrent? Did he perceive in Wallis's eyes the faint spark that suggested a new horizon? If he did, he spoke little of it, preferring perhaps the comfort of denial. For to acknowledge such a spark is to invite its flame. In those years, Wallis stood at a threshold once more. She was secure, respected in certain circles, admired for her wit and style. Yet she was also restless, ever searching for the next step, the greater challenge, the deeper recognition. Her life with Ernest had given her stability, but stability alone could not satisfy the hunger that had driven her from one chapter to the next. She had become, in truth, an actress skilled in every role she undertook: wife, hostess, friend, wit. But beneath the costumes lay the same question that had followed her since childhood: how to secure a place that could not be taken away. The sound of laughter in Mayfair houses drifts into the hush of royal apartments. The clinking of glasses fades into the murmur of a voice more familiar than any other in Britain, the voice of a prince who would one day be king. Wallis, standing poised in her second marriage, was about to step into a sphere from which there would be no retreat, a sphere where affection and ambition, charm and scandal would intertwine until they became indistinguishable. And so the story turns toward a meeting, casual in appearance yet fateful in consequence, where the gaze of a restless heir fell upon a restless woman and history began to stir. The hush of royal apartments lingered faintly in the background, like the murmur of a tide that had not yet reached the shore. And into this hush stepped Wallis, still Mrs. Simpson, but already drifting nearer to the orbit of power. Her presence in British high society was no longer that of a curious American divorcée, but of a hostess whose name appeared on the lips of those who mattered. The drawing rooms of Mayfair, the dinners where crystal gleamed under candlelight, the conversations where politics mingled with gossip, these became her stage. And though she remained an outsider by birth and by accent, her very difference lent her an allure that the English found difficult to resist. She entered these circles with the precision of an actress who had studied her role well. The lessons of Baltimore, of Asia, of her first and second marriages all coalesced into a performance of remarkable finesse. She dressed with daring elegance, garments cut with clean lines and accented by jewelry that seemed chosen not for wealth, but for impact. Her voice, low and deliberate, carried with it a rhythm unlike the clipped tones around her. She laughed often, but always with a hint of irony, as if she observed the world from a slight distance, never entirely swallowed by it. In this way, she became both participant and commentator, a presence within the room and yet somehow above it. The women of society regarded her with suspicion, yet could not ignore her. Some whispered of her divorces, her ambition, her sharp tongue. Others, secretly admiring, sought to emulate her style, her daring choices of dress, the way she could hold the attention of men who otherwise grew weary of polite conversation. The men themselves were drawn to her. She was witty, bold without vulgarity, and unafraid to meet their gaze with equal steadiness. In her company, they felt a spark of vitality often absent in the carefully mannered exchanges of their class. It was through these gatherings, through friends of friends, that her path drew closer to Edward, Prince of Wales. At first, their encounters were no more than shared rooms, casual introductions, conversations that flickered briefly and faded into the larger hum of the evening. Yet even in those early moments, something seemed to stir. Edward, known for his charm and his impatience with the rigid formality of his role, found in Wallis a freshness that intrigued him. She did not fawn over him as others did. She spoke with candor, sometimes even with teasing boldness. Where others sought to please, she unsettled, and in unsettling him, she caught his attention. London itself seemed to conspire in their gradual approach. The city of the interwar years, with its fog-draped streets and echo of past glories, was a place of contradictions. Beneath the grand facades lay anxieties of empire, of economic strain, of looming unrest. Yet in the drawing rooms and clubs of the privileged, life persisted in its rituals of elegance. Wallis, moving through this world, seemed to carry within her both the glamour of the moment and the shadow of something more disruptive. She was both familiar and foreign, both accepted and suspect. Ernest accompanied her often, loyal and unsuspecting. To him, the friendship of the Prince of Wales was an honor, a sign that he and his wife had ascended into the highest reaches of society. Perhaps he believed, as many did, that Wallis's charm was merely social, a harmless sparkle that enlivened gatherings but posed no threat. Perhaps he did not see, or chose not to see, the deeper current forming beneath the surface of polite conversation. For currents, like destinies, often begin in whispers, too faint to notice. As Wallis drew closer to the royal circle, she became increasingly skilled at navigating its subtleties. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to jest and when to bow her head, when to stand apart, and when to lean in. Her presence was calculated but never cold. She seemed at once deliberate and spontaneous, a balance that few could manage. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to weave herself into the very fabric of Edward's world. There are accounts of dinners where she sat at his side, of afternoons spent in laughter, of quiet conversations that stretched longer than propriety allowed. Each of these, small in themselves, added to a growing intimacy. Edward, long accustomed to adoration, found in Wallis not only admiration but challenge. She teased him, she questioned him, she offered opinions unsoftened by deference. In her he discovered not the role of a subject, but the presence of an equal. And perhaps this was what he craved most. For Wallis, these encounters offered more than flattery. They offered entry into a world she had observed from afar but never truly touched, the world of royalty, of decision and consequence, of names that carried weight across nations. She did not pursue it blindly. She knew the dangers, the whispers, the scandal that might arise, yet she also felt the pull of destiny, the sense that her life had been leading her towards something larger than herself. Whether she sought it deliberately or merely allowed herself to be carried by it, the effect was the same. She stood now on the threshold of history, and yet, even as she stepped further into Edward's orbit, she remained a woman bound by ambiguity. Was she guided by ambition or by the simple need for affection? Did she crave power, or did she merely seek refuge from the insecurities that had haunted her since childhood? History offers no final answer, and perhaps none exists. For human hearts are seldom governed by a single motive, and Wallis, like all who become symbols, was more complex than the image imposed upon her. The drawing rooms of Mayfair grew smaller in significance as the walls of royal residences drew closer. The voices of gossip followed her, sharp and insistent, but she carried herself with the same composure she had always worn. The outsider from Baltimore had become the confidant of a prince, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was on the verge of scandal that would echo through generations. The sound of a dinner party fades now into the hush of a private chamber, where laughter is softer, and words are no longer overheard, but held in secrecy. A friendship begins to transform into something more, delicate yet undeniable, and the question that lingers in the silence is whether this path can be walked without consequence. The hush of the private chamber, filled with laughter no longer meant for the ears of society, marked the threshold where friendship began to slip quietly into something else, something that could not easily be undone. Edward, heir to the throne of the British Empire, had long been surrounded by admirers who bent their words to flatter, who adjusted their tones to please. But Wallis, with her deliberate voice and sharp humor, offered him something different. She did not bow to his every word, nor did she conceal her impatience with triviality. She teased him as though he were a man first and a prince only second, and it was this reversal, so simple, yet so rare, that unsettled and captivated him. Their early encounters, often in the company of others, became slowly colored by an intimacy invisible to those around them. A hand lingering a little longer, a glance held across a room, a private remark that carried layers beneath its surface. These were the small gestures through which an invisible thread was woven. To the world, they were merely companions in laughter, yet behind the surface of courtesy, something deeper pulsed. The prince, restless in duty, found solace in her candor. The woman, restless in stability, found in him a mirror of her own hunger for something beyond the ordinary. It is tempting to imagine that their closeness was inevitable, yet inevitability is often only the name given after choices have been made. What drew Edward so powerfully was not only Wallis herself, but the way she stood against the tide of his life. He was accustomed to women who offered compliance. She offered contradiction. He was burdened by the expectations of a kingdom. She lifted that weight by mocking its solemnity. In her presence, he felt released, not from responsibility itself, but from the endless seriousness that surrounded it. For Wallis, the attraction was more complex. Edward was not merely a man, but a symbol, the very embodiment of a power she had observed from the outside all her life. To be close to him was to step into a realm where decisions shaped nations, where the ordinary rules of society dissolved. Yet there was also the reality of Edward himself, charming, vulnerable, eager for affection, perhaps even needy in a way that stirred her instinct to guide and control. Was it love, ambition, or the mingling of both? The question remains, like a candle whose flame flickers but never fully reveals the room it lights. As the months passed, their bond deepened. Edward invited her into his inner circle, into private gatherings at his residences, into moments guarded from the public eye. They dined, they laughed, they shared confidences in voices hushed, not only for secrecy, but for intimacy. Those who witnessed them together began to notice the subtle signs, though few dared to speak openly. The prince's attention was clear, and Wallis, though still married to Ernest, did little to conceal her presence at Edward's side. Gossip, as it always does, began to spread. Among friends, whispers grew sharper. Some regarded Wallis with admiration, noting her wit and style, the way she seemed to command even the attention of a future king. Others regarded her with suspicion, questioning her motives, wondering if she sought not companionship but power. The English press, bound by an unspoken agreement to preserve the dignity of the monarchy, remained silent. But abroad, particularly in the American press, stories began to emerge. An American divorcée in the company of the Prince of Wales. Such a tale was too enticing to be left unprinted. Ernest, ever steady, seemed for a time unaware of the storm gathering around him. Or perhaps he saw and chose to remain silent, hoping that the friendship would pass, that his wife's restless charm would eventually tire even of a prince. Yet the signs became too clear to ignore. The absences, the invitations he did not receive, the glances that lingered too long, these could not be explained away. What must it have been like for him? To stand in the presence of a love he could not rival, to know that the stability he had offered was no longer enough? Silence in such moments is not peace but despair unspoken. Edward himself grew increasingly dependent on Wallis. His letters, his gestures, his constant need for her presence revealed a man less confident than his public image suggested. He leaned upon her not only for companionship, but for guidance, for affirmation, for escape from the suffocating weight of royal expectation. In her, he found not only laughter, but a confidant, someone to whom he could reveal doubts that no minister, no courtier, no sibling could ever hear. She, in turn, seemed to relish the role, shaping his thoughts, encouraging his impulses, becoming both partner and advisor in ways unseen by the world. And yet, beneath the growing intensity of their relationship, danger brewed. For Edward was no ordinary man, and his heart was not his alone to give. He belonged also to the crown, to the empire, to a tradition that stretched back centuries. To love him was to step into a shadow where private desire and public duty clashed with merciless force. Did Wallis, in those early days, understand the scale of what she had entered? Or did she believe, as many lovers do, that passion could shield them from consequence? The quiet gatherings grew bolder. Photographs, though discreet, began to hint at their companionship. Friends spoke less cautiously. Ministers listened more closely. And slowly, the relationship that had begun with laughter in private rooms became a matter of national significance. The thread woven between them, once invisible, now gleamed in the eyes of those who watched. For Wallis, the transformation was profound. She was no longer merely an ambitious hostess, no longer merely a woman of style and wit. She was becoming a figure upon whom the fate of a crown might rest. And with each passing day, the distance between Mrs. Simpson of Baltimore and the Duchess she would one day become grew smaller. The hush of private laughter fades now into the sharp rustle of newspaper pages, the low voices of ministers behind closed doors, the uneasy silence of courtiers who sense a storm they cannot yet name. What began as an affair of the heart was becoming an affair of the state, and the world, though it did not yet see clearly, was beginning to turn its gaze toward Wallis Simpson. The rustle of newspapers, the murmur of ministers behind doors closed against the world, and the cautious glances of courtiers formed the backdrop as the bond between Edward and Wallis deepened into something undeniable. What had begun as laughter shared in private chambers now carried the weight of secrecy and the echo of scandal. The affair, though never named aloud in England's cautious press, grew into an open secret in salons, embassies, and drawing rooms. To speak her name was to stir curiosity, suspicion, admiration, and fear in equal measure. Edward was no longer merely the prince with a restless heart. He was the heir to the crown, standing ever closer to kingship as his father, King George XV, aged and weakened. Every step Edward took, every word he spoke, carried consequences beyond himself. Yet in Wallis's presence, he seemed to forget the gravity of his role, or perhaps to disregard it. He clung to her company with a fervor that unsettled those who watched. Ministers saw distraction where there should have been discipline. Courtiers sensed danger in the influence she wielded. For Edward deferred to her in ways unseemly for a man who would be king. Their companionship unfolded in plain view if one knew where to look. They were seen at house parties, at intimate dinners, at country retreats where the boundaries of propriety blurred. Edward invited her into spaces once reserved for family, once guarded from outsiders. He showered her with gifts, jewelry chosen not only for beauty, but for their symbolic weight. Each token spoke of devotion, yet also revealed dependence. He did not merely admire her, he leaned upon her as though she were the axis of his life. For Wallis, the affair was a paradox. On one hand, she enjoyed the privileges it brought, entry into circles more exalted than any she had known, the thrill of intimacy with a man destined to be king, the power of being noticed in every gathering she attended. On the other hand, she bore the weight of whispers, the knowledge that her presence was controversial, that her name was spoken in tones of scandal. Did she fear the consequences, or did she dismiss them, trusting that affection would shield her? History does not grant us her innermost thoughts, yet the ambiguity lingers, unresolved. Ernest, her husband, remained on the margins of this unfolding drama. At first he accompanied her still, standing at her side while Edward smiled too warmly, laughed too freely. But gradually his role diminished until he was more absent than present, a shadow in the background of a narrative he could not control. The strain between them grew, though not in the form of violent quarrels. Rather, it was a silence, a quiet acknowledgement that the bond once sustaining their marriage had been eclipsed by something greater, something that neither could deny. The gossip in England was contained by a press reluctant to challenge the monarchy. Yet abroad, particularly in America and continental Europe, newspapers began to print her name with boldness. Stories of the prince and the American divorcée filled columns, their tone ranging from fascination to condemnation. Back in Britain, those who read foreign papers brought whispers back to London streets, where they spread like smoke through society's corridors. What the public could not openly acknowledge, it knew nonetheless, and silence itself became complicit in the spread of scandal. Edward grew increasingly impatient with the constraints placed upon him. He resented ministers who cautioned him, family who frowned upon his choices, traditions that stood between him and the life he desired. Wallis, with her quick words and sharp laughter, seemed to him a refuge from these burdens. Yet her influence was not always soothing. She advised, she teased, she sometimes urged him toward defiance rather than restraint. To him, this was freedom. To his advisers, it was peril. It is worth asking, did Wallis truly wish to be queen, or did she simply wish to be secure in Edward's devotion? Some accounts portray her as ambitious, calculating every step to climb ever higher. Others suggest she was reluctant, fearful of the storm her presence provoked. Perhaps she herself did not know, caught between affection and apprehension, between the desire for love and the dread of its consequences. What is certain is that her relationship with Edward could not remain a private affair. The closer he drew to the throne, the more their intimacy became a matter not of sentiment, but of state. When King George V spoke of his son, he expressed doubt that Edward would prove fit for kingship. The king saw in him charm without discipline, affection without steadiness. And in the presence of Wallis, those doubts seemed confirmed. For Edward, bound more and more to her side, seemed less concerned with the affairs of empire than with the affairs of the heart. Ministers, already wary, began to see her not merely as a distraction but as a threat, a woman whose influence could compromise the dignity of the crown itself. Yet for Edward, such concerns seemed trivial. His letters to Wallis, filled with devotion, revealed a man unwilling to live without her. He spoke not only of affection but of dependence, confessing that his strength was bound to her presence. These were not the words of a prince preparing to reign with firmness, but of a man surrendering himself to love, whatever the cost. And in surrendering, he set in motion a chain of events that no one, not even Wallis, could halt. The affair had become more than an affair. It had become a question of monarchy, of duty, of history itself. The whispers of gossip had grown into the murmur of ministers, the warnings of family, the unease of a nation. And Wallis, whether she willed it or not, stood at the center of it all. The sound of whispered rumors drifts now into the heavy silence of government chambers, where men speak in cautious tones of scandal and crown, of duty and desire. The laughter of private dinners is replaced by the solemn creak of doors, closing upon secret meetings, where the fate of a kingdom begins to tremble in the balance. The solemn creak of doors closing upon secret meetings lingered like an echo in the air, and from behind those doors emerged whispers that soon carried across the nation, though never openly voiced. The affair between the king-to-be and the American woman had now reached a stage where silence was both shield and danger. In Britain, the newspapers remained quiet, bound by loyalty to the crown or by unspoken agreements with ministers who urged restraint. But silence, paradoxically, magnified the scandal, for the absence of words in the local press only drew attention to the torrent spilling from foreign papers. Across the Atlantic, in Paris, in New York, in Berlin, headlines boldly named her, their typeface black and unforgiving, Mrs. Wallis Simpson, the woman at the center of a love that threatened a monarchy. Within England's borders, citizens read fragments carried in from abroad. They spoke of it in shops, in carriages, on street corners, in voices lowered yet insistent. Gossip grew stronger with every silence. The very absence of public acknowledgement made the whispers heavier, for what cannot be spoken of becomes all the more irresistible. In parlors and pubs, in factories and schools, the question hung, unvoiced but unavoidable. Could it be true that the king was bound to a woman already married, already divorced once before, and an American at that? The ministers of state, men who valued stability above all, viewed the situation with mounting alarm. To them, this was not merely a private indiscretion, but a threat to the nation itself. For the monarchy was not only a family, it was an institution, a symbol woven into the fabric of empire. To endanger it for personal desire was, in their eyes, a recklessness unworthy of a sovereign. They met in hushed tones, debating, worrying, measuring every possibility. Yet the more they cautioned, the more Edward resisted. The warnings of duty only seemed to strengthen his resolve, as if he believed love itself was a kind of defiance against the world's demands. Wallis, meanwhile, became the unwilling or willing center of speculation. To some, she was a seductress, manipulating a king for her own gain. To others, she was a victim, caught in the storm of forces greater than herself. Her own voice was seldom heard, for she did not speak publicly, did not grant interviews, did not attempt to shape her image in the press. And yet silence again became a double-edged sword. For in the absence of her words, others filled the void with their own. Rumors of ambition, of schemes, of shadowy influences took root, and whether true or false, they clung to her name as if inseparable. The royal family watched with unease. Queen Mary, dignified and unyielding, could not accept Wallis. To her, this American woman represented everything unstable, everything dangerous to the crown. George V had already expressed doubt about his son's capacity to rule, and in the arms of Wallis, those doubts seemed vindicated. The younger brothers of Edward, particularly Albert, the Duke of York, watched with anxiety, for they understood that should Edward falter, the weight of the throne might fall upon their shoulders. The family, bound by tradition, closed ranks against the outsider, but Edward himself seemed unmoved. The world beyond the palace walls shifted as well. Europe in the 1930s was a place of instability, of rising extremism, of nations trembling between peace and war. In such a climate, the steadiness of the British crown was not a trivial matter. To have it shaken by scandal was to risk more than embarrassment. It was to risk credibility in the eyes of allies and enemies alike. And yet, in the quiet of his private rooms, Edward placed his trust not in ministers or advisers, but in Wallis. He leaned upon her, confided in her, drew from her a strength he claimed he could not find elsewhere. It is worth pausing to ask, did Wallis herself wish for the crown? Some say she feared it, that she wished only to remain at his side without the burden of titles and scrutiny. Others insist she craved it, that every step she had taken from Baltimore to London had been guided by an unspoken ambition to ascend higher than any woman of her beginnings could dream. The truth, as always, may rest in the space between. For ambition and fear often walk hand in hand, each feeding the other, each shaping decisions that cannot be undone. The silence of the British press grew increasingly strained. Editors, aware that the world outside spoke openly, began to feel the pressure of a public left in ignorance. Foreign papers were smuggled in, passed from hand to hand, their pages folded and refolded until the ink blurred. Ministers, knowing that the silence could not hold forever, urged the king to act, to end the affair before it reached the breaking point. But Edward, far from yielding, seemed emboldened. He told those closest to him that he could not, would not reign without Wallis by his side. And so the scandal grew not through revelation but through absence. It was the unprinted headline, the unspoken word, the space between sentences that gave it power. In that silence, Wallis became not merely a woman, but a symbol of defiance, of ambition, of the tension between love and duty. Symbols, once born, cannot easily be contained. They grow larger than the lives that create them, and Wallis, willingly or unwillingly, had become one. The laughter of private dinners had already transformed into the murmurs of gossip. Now those murmurs became the heavy weight of state. The crown itself seemed to tremble, not yet fallen but already loosened from its place. And at the center stood Edward and Wallis, a pair bound by affection, yet surrounded by forces that neither could fully control. The silence of the press, stretched to its limit, begins to crack, like ice under pressure. The footsteps of ministers grow more urgent, their voices more insistent, and the shadow of crisis lengthens across the halls of Buckingham Palace. What had been gossip and speculation was becoming confrontation, and soon the matter could no longer remain hidden. The silence that had held like ice beneath the strain of winter now began to crack, and through its fractures poured the murmurs of a nation, the urgency of ministers, and the watchful eyes of the world beyond Britain's shores. The year was 1936, and with the death of King George VIII, the Prince of Wales at last ascended the throne as Edward VIII. The crown, that ancient circle of duty and burden, was placed not yet upon his head in coronation, but upon his life in expectation. All eyes turned to him, and by extension, to the woman who lingered always near. The voice of Edward, confident yet carrying a note of weariness, addressed the people with the gravity of his new role. But beneath the words of kingship lay an unspoken truth. His heart was already pledged elsewhere, pledged not to empire or duty, but to Wallis Simpson. And though the proclamation of accession declared him sovereign, in the private chambers of his soul, he had already chosen allegiance to love above all else. For the people of Britain, the moment was both familiar and uncertain. A new king, young and charismatic, carried the promise of renewal. Yet already there were murmurs of unease. His habits unsettled, his interests seemed frivolous, his devotion to Wallis whispered of impropriety. And in the corridors of government, unease hardened into alarm. The ministers, guardians of stability, feared what might come if the king pursued openly what he had thus far held in shadows. For Wallis, divorced once already and still married to Ernest, stood as a figure entirely unsuited to be queen. The Church of England, bound to the crown by sacred ties, forbade such a union. The law itself seemed to conspire against them. Yet Edward pressed on. He brought Wallis into the orbit of royal life more boldly than before, introducing her to circles once closed, granting her presence at events where propriety trembled. To those who watched, his devotion was plain, his defiance unmistakable. He appeared to many less as a king governing an empire than as a man enthralled by a single woman. The question that haunted every chamber was simple. Could a monarch place personal desire above the stability of the realm? Wallis, caught within this rising tide, must have felt both exhilaration and dread. The intimacy she shared with Edward had carried her into a realm beyond imagination, yet it also placed upon her shoulders a weight she had never sought so openly. To be at the side of a king was not merely to be a companion, it was to stand against tradition, law, and the expectations of millions. Did she long for such a place, or did she fear its cost? History leaves the answer shrouded in ambiguity. In her letters, her words were careful, sometimes expressing affection, sometimes revealing hesitation. She seemed at once drawn and cautious, bound to Edward yet conscious of the storm their union invited. The ministers began to prepare. They spoke in quiet gatherings of contingency, of possibilities should the king refuse to yield. Some urged patience, believing Edward's infatuation might fade. Others saw with clarity that it would not. The Archbishop of Canterbury, guardian of moral order, insisted upon the impossibility of a divorced woman becoming queen. The government itself whispered of crisis, of abdication, of the need to protect the throne even if the man who wore the crown would not. And yet Edward, rather than retreat, grew more determined. He spoke to those close to him with unwavering conviction. He would not reign without Wallis. His devotion, expressed in private letters, revealed not the careful deliberation of a monarch, but the passionate insistence of a lover. He declared her indispensable, not only to his happiness, but to his very capacity to endure the throne. To many, it seemed that the crown itself rested not upon his head but upon hers, as though she had become the true center of his reign before it had even begun. The public, still shielded from the full extent of the affair by the silence of the press, sensed something nonetheless. The king's manner, his choices, his ever-present companion, all hinted at a story they could not yet read but already felt. And among the working men and women of Britain, opinions were divided. Some admired the romance, the defiance of tradition for the sake of love. Others saw in it folly, weakness, and betrayal of duty. The crown was more than ornament. It was the anchor of a people weary from war and wary of change. To risk it for passion seemed reckless beyond measure. In private, Wallis herself faced torment. She was by now separated from Ernest, the bonds of that marriage frayed to nothing. Yet she was not free, nor could she easily imagine herself queen. The scrutiny, the condemnation, the exile from society that might follow weighed upon her. Letters suggest moments where she considered retreat, where she doubted the path ahead. But Edward's persistence, His refusal to imagine life without her drew her back again and again. To turn away was to abandon him. To remain was to embrace peril. The corridors of Buckingham Palace grew heavy with unspoken tension. Each gesture, each appearance, each absence of the king became subject to interpretation. Ministers pressed him with increasing urgency. Family members pleaded, advisers warned, yet all to no avail. Edward seemed deaf to all but the voice of Wallis, blind to all but the vision of a future with her at his side. It is in such moments that history pauses, holding its breath. For the choice before Edward was stark: crown or love, duty or desire, the weight of empire or the whisper of intimacy. And Wallis, whether she wished it or not, became the fulcrum upon which that choice balanced. She was no longer merely a woman of wit and style. She was the figure through whom the fate of monarchy itself might be altered. The cracking silence of the press now threatened to shatter completely. Foreign headlines shouted what British papers dared not. The strain grew unbearable, and soon the question would have to be faced openly. The king could not conceal forever what the world already knew. The solemn proclamations of accession still echoed faintly, yet already their dignity was overshadowed by the rising storm. The creak of ministers' doors gave way now to the thunder of impending confrontation, and the question lingered like a tolling bell. How long could love and crown remain bound before one must be set aside? The tolling bell of choice, sounding faint but steady, now grew louder as the weeks of 1936 passed into winter. Edward VIII, crowned in duty but enthralled by love, faced the inevitable moment when silence could no longer conceal what the world already knew. The foreign press had spoken boldly, their headlines proclaiming the scandal with merciless clarity. The British press, bound by custom and loyalty, at last began to feel the cracks in its restraint. Editors could not hold back forever what was on every tongue, whispered in drawing rooms, in market stalls, in railway compartments. The king was bound to Wallis Simpson, and the matter could not remain private any longer. Within government, the tone shifted from unease to urgency. Ministers no longer spoke in cautious phrases, but in stark terms. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, carried the weight of the nation's stability upon his shoulders and pressed Edward with blunt clarity. The king could not marry a twice-divorced woman with 2 living former husbands and remain sovereign. The Church of England, of which the king was supreme governor, forbade it. The law itself recoiled at it, and beyond the law, the people, uncertain and divided, could not be asked to accept such a union without fracture. Edward listened, yet his heart seemed deaf. To every caution he replied with the same refrain. He could not reign without Wallis. He offered alternatives: marriage without queenship, a morganatic arrangement in which she would be his wife, but not his consort. Ministers rejected these as impossible, unworkable within the framework of British tradition. The tension grew sharper with every meeting. In rooms where the fate of empire was debated, the name of Wallis Simpson was spoken again and again, a name that had become inseparable from the question of monarchy itself. Wallis, meanwhile, had been sent abroad to France, removed from the immediate glare of attention. She waited in exile, listening to the murmurs of newspapers, receiving letters that carried Edward's devotion, but also his desperation. In her solitude, she must have wrestled with conflicting emotions: the affection that bound her to him, the fear of the role thrust upon her, the weight of blame that pressed heavier with every passing day. She had never sought to be beloved by a king in this way, for such love was no ordinary blessing, but a burden that threatened to consume her. Did she long for escape? Did she hope Edward would release her? Or did she cling to the belief that together they might carve a path despite the warnings? The truth, cloaked in ambiguity, remains beyond our reach. Letters from Edward during this time reveal his anguish. He pleaded, he reassured, he promised that he would not abandon her. His words revealed not the resolve of a sovereign, but the longing of a man who could not imagine life apart. He seemed less a king ruling an empire than a lover willing to cast aside all else for the sake of one woman. To some, this was touching romance. To others, it was weakness unbecoming of a monarch. The royal family stood firm. Queen Mary, dignified and unwavering, spoke with the authority of tradition. The Duke of York, Albert, cautious and reluctant, began to prepare himself for a role he had never sought, knowing that if his brother faltered, he would be called to the throne. Within the palace, the air grew heavy with inevitability. Those who had once hoped the affair might fade now understood that it would not. Edward's devotion was unshakable, and the crisis could only end with choice. And so, in December, the moment came. Edward summoned his ministers, his family, his advisors, and declared his decision. He would abdicate the throne rather than renounce Wallis. The words, though spoken calmly, carried the force of history. No English sovereign had ever chosen love over crown in such a way. In that instant, the weight of centuries shifted, and the future of the monarchy itself was altered. On the evening of December 11th, 1936, Edward addressed the nation by radio. His voice, steady yet edged with sorrow, carried into homes across Britain, into small cottages and grand houses alike. He spoke of his choice with plainness. He could not carry the heavy burden of kingship without the support of the woman he loved. To many it was a moment of shock, to others of sympathy. Some admired the sacrifice, others condemned the recklessness. But all knew they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations. Wallis, in exile, did not hear these words at his side. She remained apart, her absence more eloquent than presence. For though she was the cause, she was not the voice. The broadcast belonged to Edward alone, a man surrendering not only a crown, but the destiny shaped for him from birth. His love had triumphed, but it had triumphed at the cost of empire. What must she have felt hearing his words from afar? Relief, perhaps, that he had chosen so completely? Fear, perhaps, that the burden of that choice now rested fully upon her shoulders? For by giving up the crown, he had placed the weight of history upon their union, and nothing that followed could ever be ordinary. The nation, stunned, turned to Albert, the Duke of York, who reluctantly ascended as George VI. His quiet steadiness stood in stark contrast to his brother's romantic defiance. The monarchy, though shaken, endured. But Edward, now Duke of Windsor, stepped into exile with Wallis at his side, their lives forever marked by the choice that had undone a king. The heavy stillness of that December evening lingers still. The sound of Edward's voice fading across the airwaves gave way to silence in parlors across Britain. A crown had been set aside, not lost in battle, not seized by rebellion, but relinquished for love. And in the stillness of France, Wallis stood waiting, knowing that the life she was about to enter was both triumph and prison, both romance and exile. The quiet of her exile dissolves now into the echo of wedding bells in a foreign land, muted, unblessed, and yet binding. For in the aftermath of abdication, the question remained, what life could Edward and Wallis build together once the crown had been exchanged for their union? The muted toll of wedding bells, carried across a French garden rather than the ancient stones of Westminster, signaled the strange beginning of their new life together. It was June of 1937, half a year since Edward had spoken his abdication into the airwaves, and now, in the quiet estate of the Château de Condé, he and Wallis were joined in marriage. No cheering crowds gathered, no royal pageantry accompanied the vows, no family stood to bear witness. Instead, the ceremony unfolded in near isolation, a union both triumphant and wounded, clothed in love yet veiled in rejection. Wallis, elegant in pale blue, carried herself with the same composure she had always worn, as though refusing to betray the tremors that must have stirred beneath her poise. Edward, stripped now of crown but newly titled Duke of Windsor, looked upon her not as a monarch, but as a man who had relinquished all for the sake of one woman. The words spoken that day were not merely vows of affection, but the sealing of a destiny already marked by sacrifice. Yet the absence around them spoke louder than the vows themselves, for no member of the royal family attended, no blessing was given. They had not only married each other, they had also married themselves to exile. From that moment their lives became a paradox, gilded by wealth and privilege, yet shadowed by exclusion. They were denied residence in England, permitted only brief visits. The royal household withheld full recognition. Even the title of Her Royal Highness, which Edward begged for Wallis, was refused. She would be styled Duchess of Windsor, but always without the honorific that marked full belonging. It was a reminder, sharp and enduring, that though she had won the man, she would never be fully embraced by the institution he had surrendered. Their home became France, first in the countryside and later in the glittering salons of Paris. They furnished their lives with elegance, collecting jewels, art, and the company of those drawn to their peculiar mixture of glamour and scandal. Wallis, ever meticulous in dress and manner, became a figure of fashion, her photographs filling the pages of society magazines. Edward, freed from the weight of kingship, seemed at times lightened, at other times adrift. Together they built a world that glittered on the surface, but often concealed loneliness beneath. The rejection of the royal family lay upon them like a quiet frost. Edward longed for reconciliation, for the warmth of his mother's approval, for the acknowledgement of his brothers. Yet the family remained distant, their silence as cold as the marble halls of Windsor itself. Wallis, though she had never expected to be embraced, must have felt the sting of being cast perpetually as outsider. Every photograph of the royal family without her, every ceremony from which they were excluded, reinforced the truth. They lived at the edge of history, close enough to see but never to touch. And yet exile carried its own strange freedom. They traveled, they dined with princes and magnates, they lived in houses filled with servants and finery. Wallis cultivated her role as Duchess with precision, ensuring that her style, her wit, her presence commanded attention wherever she appeared. Edward, ever dependent, leaned upon her as his anchor. Their lives, though marked by absence of duty, became an endless performance of elegance, as if by maintaining the surface, they could shield themselves from the emptiness beneath. Was this exile a victory or a prison? To some, they appeared enviable, living among the glitter of Paris, sipping champagne under chandeliers, attending endless soirees. To others, they seemed tragic, wandering figures who had traded duty for indulgence, love for isolation. The truth, as always, lay between. They had chosen each other, and that choice had brought both privilege and penalty. The world itself shifted around them. Europe in the late 1930s grew tense with the rise of ideologies that threatened to plunge it once more into war. In this climate, Edward and Wallis found themselves objects not only of social gossip but of political suspicion. Their connections, their travels, their friendships with figures of influence became subjects of scrutiny. To live in exile was not only to be free of the crown, but also to be vulnerable to the gaze of governments, uncertain of where their loyalties lay. In private, perhaps, they asked themselves what their sacrifice had truly gained. Edward had given up a crown, but had he found happiness? Wallis had secured the devotion of a man, but had she also inherited a burden heavier than any crown could be? They moved through their days with elegance, yet in the quiet of night, when servants withdrew and laughter faded, did they not hear the hollow echo of what had been lost? The muted wedding bells of Condé did not fade entirely. They lingered in memory as both triumph and lament. For in marrying, they had secured each other, but in doing so, they had bound themselves to a life forever marked by absence. Love had triumphed, yes, but triumph can carry the taste of exile. And exile, though gilded, remains exile. The image of their French estate softens now into the gleam of Parisian lights, salons alive with laughter and smoke, music drifting from gramophones, and eyes turning always toward the couple who had defied a crown. Yet within those lights lay shadows, for even as they shone in society's gaze, darker questions of loyalty and suspicion were beginning to stir around them. The gleam of Parisian lights shimmered upon the Seine, their reflections trembling as though uncertain whether they belonged to earth or sky. And within that shimmer moved Edward and Wallis, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. They had become figures of fascination, their presence at soirées and on the boulevards as dazzling as it was divisive. In salons heavy with smoke and perfume, their names were spoken with admiration, envy, or disdain, yet never with indifference. For here were two people who had altered the course of monarchy, who had placed love above empire, and now lived not in palaces but in drawing rooms, not under the solemn gaze of Westminster, but beneath the glitter of Parisian chandeliers. Their life abroad carried all the trappings of glamour. They mingled with artists, aristocrats, financiers, and adventurers. They were seen along the Riviera, where the sea lay blue and endless, and where laughter echoed across terraces lined with marble. Wallis, ever precise in her dress, appeared in gowns that became markers of fashion, each detail curated, each line deliberate. Her jewels, gifts from Edward, shimmered under the light of chandeliers, catching eyes and tongues alike. Edward, though no longer sovereign, retained the charm that had once made him the darling of his people. Together they were spectacle, and society, ever hungry for spectacle, welcomed them eagerly. Yet beneath the glamour lingered shadows. For all their invitations, they were also excluded. They were admired but not embraced, observed but not fully trusted. The royal family kept them at a distance, permitting only rare visits, always constrained. Edward felt the chill of this rejection deeply, longing for reconciliation that never truly came. Wallis bore it with outward composure, yet she too must have felt the sting of perpetual exclusion, of being marked as the cause of rupture, rather than as the woman who had simply followed the path laid before her. Their days unfolded in a rhythm both luxurious and repetitive. Mornings spent in villas overlooking the sea, afternoons drifting from luncheon to tea, evenings alive with music and champagne. They surrounded themselves with friends and companions, yet the presence of others could not erase the solitude that followed them wherever they went. For glamour, like silk, conceals but does not heal. And within their private world there remained the unanswerable question: had they won or had they lost? Edward, relieved of duty, sometimes seemed lighter, freed from the burdens of monarchy. Yet at other times he appeared adrift, a man without purpose, clinging to Wallis as though she alone gave meaning to his days. He placed upon her shoulders the role of companion, confidant, advisor, and anchor, roles heavy for any one person to bear. Wallis, though skilled in poise, must have felt the weight of his dependence. She had married not only a man, but also the shadow of a throne, a shadow that followed them across borders and through every door they entered. The world itself was shifting. Europe, glittering in its last years of fragile peace, trembled with the rise of powers that threatened to plunge it once more into war. Against this backdrop, the Windsors lived in a world of parties and photographs, yet whispers of suspicion began to gather around them. Their connections, their travels, their friendships with figures of influence aroused questions. Were they merely exiles seeking solace in society? Or were they drawn, willingly or not, into currents larger than themselves? These suspicions would grow heavier with time, but in those first years they remained little more than murmurs, faint clouds against a sky still filled with sunlight. The paradox of their existence lay in its doubleness. To many, they were symbols of romance, proof that love could triumph over duty, that one could choose the heart over the crown. To others, they were symbols of recklessness, of selfishness, of a monarchy weakened by indulgence. Wherever they went, these judgments followed, and though they could not silence them, they learned to live with them, as one learns to live with an echo one cannot escape. Wallis herself became a figure of enduring fascination. Photographers sought her, designers studied her. Writers described her in terms both flattering and cruel. She was elegant, yes, but also sharp, stylish, yet enigmatic. Some called her cold, others charming. She was never what anyone expected, and perhaps this was her greatest power, to remain always a little beyond definition. For in being indefinable, she became unforgettable. And yet, for all her poise, one imagines moments of weariness. To be always watched, always judged, always marked as the woman who changed the crown. Such a role leaves little room for rest. In the quiet of night, when the laughter of guests had faded and the lamps were dimmed, did she not feel the ache of solitude, the longing for a simpler belonging she had never truly known? Perhaps she did. Perhaps beneath the jewels and the silk, she carried the same hunger that had driven her since childhood, the hunger for a place secure, unshakable, beyond exclusion. But such a place remained elusive, even in exile gilded with gold. Edward and Wallis drifted between France and the Riviera, their lives a tapestry of light and shadow. They seemed always to be both at the center and at the edge, celebrated yet displaced. In every room they entered, the air shifted as though the weight of their story walked in before them, and those who observed could not decide whether to envy or to pity, to admire or to condemn. The shimmering lights of Parisian salons soften now into darker tones as the clouds gathering over Europe grow heavier. Music and laughter still fill the rooms, but outside, the world edges ever closer to turmoil. And within those rooms, eyes glance toward the Windsors not only with curiosity but with suspicion, as whispers of politics begin to mingle with whispers of scandal. The laughter of salons, the glitter of chandeliers, the rustle of silk gowns, all soften now as darker clouds rolled over Europe. By 1939, the continent trembled under the weight of conflict, and the Windsors, once merely figures of romance and scandal, became subjects of suspicion. For their exile, gilded though it was, placed them in circles where politics and power mingled with gossip, where the company one kept was scrutinized as carefully as the clothes one wore. And in those shifting shadows, whispers arose that Edward and Wallis were too close to Germany, too sympathetic to its leaders, too vulnerable to the lures of influence that might serve purposes beyond their own. Their travels during those years, particularly to Germany itself in 1937, fed these suspicions. Photographs captured them smiling, shaking hands with figures who would soon cast the world into darkness. Among them was Adolf Hitler, who received them at Berchtesgaden with courtesy and ceremony. The images, once printed, ignited outrage in Britain and beyond. What were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor doing in such company? Were they naive, merely indulging curiosity, or were they swayed by promises whispered into their ears? No answer ever fully satisfied, and history has left the question open, a riddle neither entirely innocent nor wholly damning. Edward's own grievances against his family and his government may have made him susceptible to German flattery. He resented the rejection he had suffered, the denial of Wallis's title, the coldness with which his family treated him. To a man wounded in pride, the attentions of foreign leaders may have seemed a balm, even if offered in dangerous guise. Wallis, for her part, cultivated charm wherever she went, her manner of poised conversation as effective in foreign courts as in English drawing rooms. Yet charm, when seen through the eyes of suspicion, becomes evidence of alliance. And so the Windsors, whether through intention or accident, found themselves cast in a role they may never have sought. Figures whose loyalties were questioned at the very moment loyalty mattered most. When war erupted, their lives shifted once more. They moved from France to Spain, from Spain to Portugal, their journey shadowed by rumors of intrigue. Letters and reports circulated, suggesting that the Germans hoped to use them to restore Edward to the throne as a puppet, sympathetic to their cause. Whether these plans had substance or were merely speculation remains unclear, but the mere possibility was enough to alarm British intelligence. The Windsors were not only exiles, they were now liabilities. The government acted swiftly. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas, a post far from Europe, far from the reach of intrigue. To some, it was exile within exile, a calculated effort to remove him from danger or from usefulness to others. Wallis followed, and together they found themselves on islands ringed by turquoise seas, a paradise in appearance, yet isolating in truth. For the Duke of Windsor, the role was little more than ceremonial, a reminder that he had once been destined for power and was now relegated to a governorship few envied. For Wallis, it was another chapter of endurance, a stage far from the glitter of Paris, where the echo of scandal still followed, but where the sun and sea could not erase the sense of banishment. The Bahamian years revealed both resilience and discontent. Edward chafed at the limits of his post, longing for relevance. Wallis adapted as she always did, arranging her surroundings with care, hosting with elegance, shaping an image even in isolation. Yet beneath the surface, unease persisted. Rumors of sympathy for Germany never wholly vanished. Whispers of betrayal hovered, and the British government kept careful watch. To live under such suspicion is to carry an invisible burden, a weight that distorts even the smallest gestures. Were they guilty of disloyalty or merely careless in their associations? The truth remains obscured, a fog through which historians still peer uncertainly. For Wallis, these years may have deepened her sense of displacement. She had never been fully accepted in England, never embraced by the royal family, and now she was marked further by suspicion. She, who had once been a woman striving to belong, found herself cast ever more firmly as outsider, as exile, as figure of ambiguity. Yet she bore it with her usual composure, her appearance flawless, her voice measured, her presence unshaken. The mask remained even if the woman behind it felt the sting of isolation. It is tempting to imagine her at night, gazing across the waters of Nassau, the waves glimmering in moonlight, and asking herself whether the path she had walked had been chosen or imposed. Was she truly the architect of scandal, or merely its instrument? Did she crave power, or did she simply seek security and affection, only to find herself at the center of forces she never wished to command? The answers lie buried in the silence she maintained, for she rarely confessed her inner thoughts. The Duchess of Windsor lived always in roles, never in confessions. When the war at last drew to its close, the Windsors returned to Europe, their reputation never fully cleansed. They settled once more into the salons of Paris, into the pattern of exile that had defined their lives since 1937. The whispers of wartime suspicion lingered, never disproved, never confirmed, like shadows that cannot be dispelled by light. For some, they were traitors in sympathy, if not in deed. For others, they were merely foolish, too vain, too self-absorbed to see the gravity of the company they kept. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Their names carried an ambiguity that time has never erased. The laughter of Paris resumed, the glitter of jewels returned, yet beneath it all lay a hollowness deeper than before. For glamour, once shadowed by scandal, may intrigue, but glamour shadowed by suspicion can corrode. Edward and Wallis, living in a house filled with treasures, became in many eyes not romantic exiles, but questionable figures. Their love story tarnished by politics, their devotion overshadowed by doubt. The turquoise seas of Nassau fade now into the polished salons of post-war Paris, where champagne glasses still clink, but where laughter carries a sharper note, edged with irony. And in those rooms the Windsors remained at the center, admired, envied, and yet never trusted, their names forever bound to a scandal that was no longer only of love, but of loyalty itself. The polished salons of post-war Paris, alive once more with chatter, perfume, and the clink of crystal glasses, offered Edward and Wallis a stage upon which to resume their performance of elegance. Yet though the rooms were filled with laughter, the music soft and insistent, there was an edge to their presence now, an irony sharpened by years of suspicion and exile. They were admired still, photographed often, written about endlessly, but trust had evaporated, and what remained was spectacle without substance, glamour repeated, until it became a mask rather than a revelation. They settled into a residence on the Bois de Boulogne, a villa furnished with the finest treasures. Within its walls they surrounded themselves with art, antiques, and jewels, every surface gleaming with the weight of wealth. Wallis, as always, curated their surroundings with meticulous care, ensuring that each room spoke of refinement. Each dinner reflected her mastery of style. Visitors stepped into an environment as carefully constructed as any stage set, where nothing was accidental, where every gesture was choreographed. For Wallis, appearance was armor, and she wore it not only in her gowns, but in her very home. The long middle years of their life in Paris unfolded in a pattern, both luxurious and repetitive. They dined, they traveled, they hosted. They appeared in photographs published by glossy magazines, their faces framed by jewels and laughter. They walked the boulevards, attended the races, lounged along the Riviera. To the outside world, it seemed a life of enviable indulgence. Yet beneath the repetition, hollowness grew. For Edward no longer carried purpose, no longer held the crown that once defined his existence. He became instead the Duke of Windsor, a title that concealed more loss than triumph, a man whose destiny had been surrendered for love, but who now often appeared restless, searching for meaning. Wallis, too, seemed caught in the paradox of her own making. She was celebrated for her elegance, her fashion, her sharp wit. Designers admired her, society envied her. Yet she was also mocked, dismissed as frivolous, condemned as manipulative. The weight of history's judgment pressed upon her shoulders, even as she smiled for cameras. And though she bore it all with composure, behind the flawless posture may have lingered fatigue. For to live as a symbol is to live without rest, to be always on display, to never set aside the mask. Their relationship, once electrified by passion and defiance, settled now into something quieter, tinged with monotony. Edward, increasingly dependent, relied on Wallis not only for companionship, but for direction, for affirmation. She managed their lives, their finances, their appearances. She guided conversations, arranged their social circle, orchestrated the details of their existence. He, in turn, deferred to her with devotion that sometimes appeared less romantic than childlike, as though she were the axis upon which he turned. To outsiders, it seemed an inversion of roles. The man who had once been king now appeared diminished, while the woman who had once been outsider now ruled their small kingdom of exile. Was she content with this role, or did it weary her? Perhaps both. To be at the center of his world was a kind of power, yet to bear responsibility for his happiness, his decisions, his very sense of purpose may have felt like a burden heavier than any crown. The irony of her life was stark. She had been blamed for bringing down a king, yet in truth, she had also kept him from collapse, sustaining him through decades of exile that might otherwise have consumed him. Their public image was curated with precision, but the private reality carried its shadows. Friends noted moments of tension, quarrels sharp but fleeting, silences heavy but unspoken. Yet they remained together, bound by the same devotion that had once shaken a monarchy. Their love had endured, but it had also transformed, no longer the fiery defiance of youth, but the weary entanglement of lives that could not be separated. Photographs of Wallis from these years reveal her as an icon of style. Slim, elegant, with gowns fitted perfectly, jewels chosen with daring precision, she appeared as the very embodiment of grace. Yet in her eyes, some claimed there was a trace of hardness, a reflection of years spent defending herself against a world that never ceased to judge. Edward, beside her, smiled with boyish charm, yet his face too showed the lines of regret, the weariness of a man who had given up the greatest role on earth and now lived in its shadow. The world around them changed, yet their existence remained curiously static. Empires shifted, wars ended, generations rose and fell, but the Windsors continued their circuit of Paris, New York, Riviera. Their story was already written in the eyes of the world. The king who gave up the throne, the woman for whom he did it. Every appearance, every photograph, every article returned to the same narrative, as though their lives had been frozen in 1936, unable to move beyond the scandal that defined them. In this repetition lay the essence of their exile. They lived not in obscurity, but in spectacle, not in silence, but in an echo chamber of their past. The glamour was real, the jewels genuine, the parties filled with laughter, yet behind it all lingered a sense of futility, of lives polished to a mirror shine that reflected only the same image again and again. And yet, within this hollowness, there was tenderness too. Edward remained devoted to Wallis, writing notes, speaking words of affection, leaning upon her as though she were the foundation of his very existence. She, though sharp in wit and sometimes in tongue, remained by his side, enduring the weight of his dependence, arranging his comfort, guarding his dignity. Theirs was a love forged in fire, tempered in exile, and though time dulled its edge, it never broke. The salons of Paris, filled with their presence, begin now to grow quieter, the chatter fading into softer tones. For as the years advanced, Edward's health declined, and Wallis's role as Duchess of Windsor shifted once more, from hostess and icon to caretaker and guardian. The glamour, though still present, could not conceal the slow approach of mortality, nor could the jewels sparkle brightly enough to distract from the fading light of the man who had once been king. The quiet salons of Paris, once filled with the rustle of silk gowns and the soft sparkle of conversation, grew heavier in tone as the years advanced. The Duke of Windsor, once the vibrant prince who had captured hearts across an empire, now began to falter beneath the slow, relentless erosion of time. His health declined, his frame weakened, his once bright charm softened into the frailty of age. And in this fading light, it was Wallis who remained his constant, no longer only the dazzling hostess or the subject of gossip, but the caretaker who tended to him with diligence and resolve. Their home on the Bois de Boulogne became a quieter place. Visitors still came, but the laughter that once filled its rooms grew subdued, conversation shortened by the reality of Edward's weariness. Doctors were summoned, servants moved with caution, and the Duchess, ever poised, arranged her days around the needs of her husband. She ensured he was comfortable, oversaw his medicines, shielded him from fatigue. The woman once accused of destroying a king now became the guardian who preserved what remained of him. Edward, for his part, remained devoted, his affection for Wallis undiminished by the frailties of his body. He leaned on her not only for care, but for companionship, speaking to her with the same words of devotion he had once written in letters during their exile. To him, she was still, "the woman I love," the phrase he had once spoken to a nation. That devotion, though sometimes mocked as weakness by outsiders, carried within it a tenderness that could not be denied. For theirs was a bond forged in defiance, tempered by scandal, and now softened by the long endurance of years. To those who knew them, the reversal of roles was striking. The man who had once been king, who had once commanded courtiers and ministers, now relied upon a single woman for the simplest rhythms of daily life. And Wallis, who had once been the outsider, the interloper, now held authority within their small kingdom of exile. She arranged the household, managed the visitors, oversaw the care of her husband. Her wit remained sharp, her elegance undiminished, yet beneath it all was a patience few had expected of her. The world had accused her of selfishness, but in these years she revealed a devotion less visible, yet no less real. It is worth reflecting on the irony of this transformation. The woman who had been painted as a destroyer became a preserver. The scandalous duchess accused of ambition became the devoted nurse. And the man who had given up all for love found in his final years that love meant not only passion but care, not only romance but endurance. In this inversion lay the quiet truth of their lives, that beyond the glitter, beyond the judgment, there was simply a man and a woman bound together, for better or for worse. The decline of Edward's health stretched across years, a slow erosion rather than a sudden collapse. There were days of brightness, when he would smile, when his old charm would return, when they would sit together in the garden and speak of memories softened by distance. But there were also days of heaviness, when fatigue weighed upon him, when the Duchess's concern was visible in the tightness of her composure. Visitors who came during these years often remarked upon her vigilance, her refusal to let him suffer without attention. Whatever else was said of Wallis Simpson, none could deny her loyalty in this role. And yet, even in these years, their existence carried the shadow of exclusion. The royal family remained distant, their gestures of reconciliation rare and formal. Edward, though resigned, never ceased to long for a warmth that never came. Wallis, for her part, bore the coldness with practiced indifference, though perhaps in private she too felt the sting. They remained, as ever, figures at the edge of the story, acknowledged but never embraced. Even as illness approached, the crown that Edward had once relinquished remained a silent barrier, reminding them both of the world from which they were forever set apart. When the end drew near, it came not as a shock, but as the culmination of years of decline. Edward passed in 1972 in the house in Paris that had sheltered their exile. Wallis was at his side, having kept her vigil through his final days, her devotion unbroken. He was buried at Frogmore, within the royal grounds at Windsor, at last returning to the soil of the family that had rejected him, yet in death granting him a place among them. And by his side, in years to come, Wallis, too, would be laid to rest. In those days following his passing, Wallis must have felt the hollowness of silence more sharply than ever. The man for whom she had endured scandal, for whom she had lived in exile, for whom she had borne suspicion and judgment was gone. And though she remained Duchess, though she remained surrounded by possessions and attended by servants, she was now profoundly alone. Her role as caretaker had ended, and what remained was solitude, heavy and unyielding. The quiet tenderness of their final years lingers like the fading notes of a melody, gentle but insistent. It reminds us that behind the weight of history, behind the judgments of scandal, there existed a bond of intimacy that endured until the very end. And as Wallis stepped into widowhood, the world that had once spoken her name with fascination now watched her with a different gaze, curious to see how the woman who had changed the crown would face her final years alone. The silence of mourning now dissolves into the even deeper silence of seclusion, where the Duchess of Windsor, no longer companion but widow, withdrew into the shadows of her Paris home, hidden from view, slowly becoming a ghost of her own legend. The silence of mourning stretched long after Edward's passing, settling upon the house in Paris like dust upon untouched furniture. The Duchess of Windsor, now a widow, drifted into a solitude heavier than any exile she had known before. For decades she had been bound to him, first in defiance, then in scandal, then in the daily rhythms of companionship and care. With his death in 1972, her role dissolved, and what remained was absence, a hollow echo in rooms that once carried his voice, his laughter, his boyish charm. She was still the Duchess, still surrounded by jewels and silks, still attended by servants, yet without him, the titles and treasures seemed stripped of meaning. The funeral at Frogmore had been a moment of reluctant reconciliation. Edward was laid to rest within the royal grounds, among the ancestors whose legacy he had once relinquished. The Queen, his niece, offered the solemn dignity of ceremony, and the family gathered with formality, if not with warmth. Wallis, draped in black, stood at the edge of this royal tableau, the outsider even in grief. She was present, acknowledged, yet never embraced. It was Edward's blood, not her presence, that had allowed him to return to Windsor in death. For her, the act carried the taste of irony, an acceptance that belonged to him but not to her. After the funeral, she returned to Paris, to the villa that now felt cavernous, each room a reminder of absence. The mirrors reflected only her own figure, thinner, more fragile, as though widowhood itself had etched its lines upon her face. She withdrew increasingly from society, no longer the hostess whose dinners had once commanded attention, no longer the figure of scandal and style. Visitors grew fewer, invitations rarer. The world, fascinated for decades, seemed to move on, leaving her behind as a relic of a story already fading into history. Her jewels, once glittering emblems of devotion, lay locked away, admired only on rare occasions. Her gowns, once the language through which she spoke her presence, hung unused, shadows of past brilliance. Even her sharp wit, the weapon with which she had carved her place in society, seemed dulled by solitude. For wit requires an audience, and without Edward, without companions eager to lean closer at her words, the spark dwindled. What remained was silence, and silence offers no stage for performance. The servants who remained cared for her with diligence, yet theirs was a service devoid of intimacy. They provided comfort, meals, order, but they could not fill the absence of companionship, the absence of the one man who had bound her life to meaning. She, who had once been accused of ambition, now seemed reduced to endurance, surviving each day within walls that grew more confining as her strength waned. There is a poignancy in these years, a kind of slow unraveling. The woman who had once dazzled Paris and London, who had once been whispered of in every newspaper across the globe, became almost invisible. Rare photographs show her frail, guarded, shielded from view by attendants. The elegance remained, but it was elegance worn thin, elegance without vitality. The eyes that had once commanded attention seemed distant, as though retreating into memories known only to her. One wonders what thoughts filled her solitude. Did she replay the moments of youth, of laughter in the company of Edward before duty collapsed upon them? Did she recall the bright salons of Baltimore, the restless streets of Asia, the glittering dinners of London? Or did she dwell instead upon the weight of blame that had pursued her, the endless speculation, the suspicions that had tarnished her name? Perhaps she thought of both, for memory is seldom selective. It brings sweetness and bitterness alike. Her isolation was not only personal, but symbolic. The royal family, though maintaining a distant courtesy, did not embrace her. She remained excluded as she had always been, the outsider who had entered their story not by welcome, but by disruption. Even in widowhood, this exclusion continued, as though the act of Edward's abdication had written her permanently into the margins. She bore it with silence, as she had borne much else, yet the silence was heavy, a silence without the balancing voice of her husband. As the years slipped by, her health declined. She grew increasingly frail, her world shrinking to the confines of her home. The gardens that once echoed with laughter now stood quiet, their flowers blooming unseen. The salons where she had once presided became empty shells, dusted but unused. She drifted through them like a shadow, a figure fading even as she lived. And yet, even in this decline, she remained the Duchess of Windsor. The title, though stripped of Her Royal Highness, still clung to her, a reminder of the story that had defined her. Visitors who spoke of her still used it, still linked her name to the abdication, to the scandal, to the love that had altered a crown. She'd become less a person than a legend, less a woman than a symbol. And legends, though they may fade from sight, remain in memory, haunting and unresolved. The solitude of her widowhood lingers like a long twilight, where the light fades, but darkness does not fully descend. She endured it with the same composure she had shown throughout her life, yet beneath it must have lain a sorrow that words could not capture. To have been at the center of one of history's greatest dramas, and to end in such seclusion, carries a bitter symmetry. The woman who had once stood beside a king now sat alone, her days marked by silence, her story already drifting into myth. The quiet of Parisian rooms, heavy with dust and silence, softens now into the image of a house slowly closing its shutters. For as her years dwindled, Wallis became less visible, less present, until she was spoken of only in the past tense, even while she yet lived, and the world, curious still, awaited the final chapter of the Duchess of Windsor, the woman who had once changed the crown and now seemed to vanish into shadow. The shutters of the Paris house, once opened wide to admit sunlight and the curious gaze of visitors, drew steadily closed as the years of the Duchess of Windsor's widowhood lengthened. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Wallis became less a figure of society and more a ghost within her own home, glimpsed only rarely, her presence reported in whispers rather than in photographs. The world that had once chased her for stories and images now spoke of her absence, of her retreat, of the silence that surrounded her as tightly as the walls of her villa. Illness had weakened her, and frailty confined her. She, who had once been the orchestrator of salons and the axis of conversation, now lay hidden from view, her days measured not by the rhythm of dinners and parties, but by the quiet ministrations of nurses and attendants. Servants came and went, keeping the machinery of her household intact, but the rooms that had once glowed with laughter and candlelight were hushed, their chandeliers gleaming only for themselves. Time seemed to gather like dust in the corners, settling upon the once glittering life until it became still and airless. Wallis no longer dressed for cameras, no longer chose gowns and jewels with the precision of a strategist. The clothes remained, carefully preserved in wardrobes, the jewels kept in vaults, but the woman who had animated them withdrew. Her once sharp wit, the spark that had unsettled princes and charmed kings, was rarely heard. Visitors who were permitted entry spoke of a figure frail and quiet, her eyes distant, her words few. She had become an emblem of silence, her story already told, her role already played. The world outside moved on. Generations rose who knew her name, not from scandal remembered, but from history books and magazine articles. For them, she was less a woman than a story. The American divorcée for whom a king gave up his crown. They did not know her laughter, her sharpness, her elegance in movement. They knew only the legend, the silhouette. And within her Paris home, she lived with the irony of being alive yet already transformed into a figure of myth. Loneliness, too, must have pressed heavily. Edward's absence was a void she could not fill. For decades she had been his companion, his advisor, his caretaker. Now, without him, her life became a long corridor with no destination, a sequence of days blending into each other. The companions who had once surrounded them drifted away, claimed by their own deaths or by the natural erosion of time. The salons no longer called for her, the newspapers no longer chased her. The very world that had once seemed unable to let her alone now seemed to forget her. There were, of course, gestures of curiosity. Journalists speculated about her condition. Biographers probed into her past. Photographers lingered at the gates of her villa, hoping for a glimpse. But she rarely appeared. Curtains drawn, doors closed, her seclusion became nearly complete. She existed not as a participant in the world, but as a shadow upon its memory, a reminder of a story that had once shaken empires. Some have said she was controlled in these years, that those around her guarded her too fiercely, limiting access, speaking in her name, arranging her affairs while she grew weaker. Whether this was protection or exploitation remains debated, but what is certain is that she, who had once commanded attention, was now shielded from it, hidden even from those who still wished to see her. The Duchess of Windsor, once the center of scandal and style, became invisible. And yet, even in invisibility, her legend endured. Writers still argued over her motives, whether she had been manipulative or merely misunderstood. Historians still debated whether she had loved Edward truly or whether she had been carried by ambition into waters deeper than she intended. Admirers praised her elegance. Detractors condemned her coldness. She, who had once been unable to escape judgment, now found that judgment followed her even in silence, even in seclusion. Perhaps she herself, in her quiet moments, reflected upon the irony. She had lived a life that seemed always at the center, yet now she was relegated to the edge, the world turning without her. Did she regret the choices that had bound her to Edward? Or did she find solace in the devotion they had shared, however heavy its price? The answer remains unspoken, for she left no confessions, no revelations. She bore her final years with the same silence with which she had borne so many accusations before. The villa itself became a kind of mausoleum in her lifetime, filled with the treasures of her past, yet emptied of vitality. Each jewel, each piece of furniture, each photograph was a relic of the life she and Edward had lived together, but without his presence, they were mere artifacts. Visitors described the atmosphere as heavy, a house not of the living, but of the lingering past. In its halls, the sound of footsteps echoed against absence, and the Duchess herself seemed more ghost than mistress. By the time of her death in 1986, she had become to the world less a person than a closing chapter. She passed away in Paris, her body frail, her voice long since stilled. And yet her death, like her life, was not only personal but symbolic. It marked the end of an era, the closing of a story that had begun in Baltimore and stretched across continents, through scandals and crowns, through exile and seclusion. Her body was carried back to England, to Frogmore, where she was laid beside Edward. In death, she at last entered the royal grounds not as visitor or intruder, but as companion, resting beside the man who had given up his throne for her. The irony of this final reconciliation cannot be overlooked. Excluded in life, yet embraced in death, she joined the dynasty that had resisted her, sealed forever in its soil. The closed shutters of her Paris home dissolve now into the quiet earth of Frogmore, where two graves lie side by side, marked not only by names and titles, but by a story that changed a crown. And though her house stands silent, her presence endures in the unresolved questions she left behind, questions that will forever invite reflection. The quiet earth of Frogmore, where two graves rest side by side beneath the shadow of Windsors trees, brings the tale of Edward and Wallis to its close, though their story continues to reverberate across time. In death, they were united where, in life, they had been separated, laid among the sovereigns and consorts of Britain, as if history itself had at last granted them a place that the living had refused. Visitors who wander through the gardens pause at their simple stones, reading the names not only of a duke and a duchess, but of two figures whose choices altered the course of monarchy. And as the wind stirs through the leaves, one wonders whether the peace of earth can soothe what turmoil life never reconciled. Wallis's legacy remains unsettled, her image suspended between admiration and condemnation. To some, she is remembered as a woman of elegance, of unyielding composure, of wit that unsettled kings and charmed courts. To others, she is cast as an adventuress, ambitious, manipulative, the cause of scandal and the shadow that tainted Edward's reign before it ever truly began. Few figures in modern history have inspired such contradictory judgments, and fewer still have left so many questions unanswered. Did she love Edward as deeply as he loved her? Did she crave power, or did power find her unprepared? Was she the architect of the abdication, or merely the vessel of Edward's restless will? The answers remain elusive, hidden beneath her silence and the myths constructed around her. What is certain is that her presence changed the monarchy forever. The abdication crisis of 1936 reshaped the destiny of Britain, placing George VI upon the throne and, in time, Elizabeth II. The stability and endurance of the monarchy in the 20th century grew directly from the decision Edward made for Wallis, and so indirectly from Wallis herself. Without her, the crown might have taken a different path. The line of succession altered, the history of a nation reshaped. In this sense, she stands not only as a figure of scandal, but as a pivot of destiny, the woman whose life redirected the course of empire. Her style, too, has left its mark. Designers and historians alike recall her impeccable dress, her daring choices, her sense of presence. She understood clothing not merely as ornament, but as language, a means of asserting identity in a world determined to question her belonging. Each gown, each jewel, each carefully chosen gesture was part of the script she wrote for herself, a script that made her unforgettable. Even now, photographs of her retain their allure. Slim figure, poised carriage, eyes sharp with intelligence, lips curved in irony or command. Fashion fades, yet her image endures, a study in elegance as armor. But beyond the surface, her story remains a meditation on belonging and exile. From her earliest days in Baltimore, she lived at the edge of circles, striving to enter, learning to charm, refusing to accept exclusion. Her first marriage brought disappointment, her second security, her third a crown relinquished for her sake. At every turn, she sought stability and found instead displacement, sought acceptance and found exile. Even as Duchess of Windsor, surrounded by riches and recognition, she remained always at the edge, admired but not embraced, present but not accepted. Her life reveals the paradox of those who reach the heights of visibility but remain outsiders still. It is tempting to imagine her ghost walking through the gardens of Frogmore at night, glancing at the stones of queens and kings who once turned their faces from her. Does she smile in irony, knowing she lies among them after all? Or does she weep in silence, longing even in death for the acceptance denied her in life? Such questions belong to imagination, yet they speak to the unresolved tension of her legacy. For Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor will forever be both insider and outsider, both central and excluded, both beloved and reviled. Her story also reminds us of the fragility of power, the way in which empires and crowns can be swayed not by armies, but by the private decisions of individuals. A king gave up his throne, not in defeat on the battlefield, but in the solitude of his heart, for the sake of a woman whose love he could not relinquish. And in that act, history itself was altered. It is a reminder that beneath the weight of institutions lies always the human, with all its frailty, desire, and longing. As listeners, we may ask ourselves, was this a story of love's triumph or of its folly? Did Edward and Wallis prove that the heart is greater than duty, or did they reveal the peril of placing desire above responsibility? Each reader, each generation, answers differently. Some admire the romance, others condemn the recklessness. Yet perhaps the truth lies not in choosing one view, but in holding both, in acknowledging that love can be both beautiful and destructive, both tender and tragic. In the end, Wallis's life is less a solved riddle than a mirror, reflecting the fears and hopes of those who consider her. To some, she is cautionary, to others, inspirational. To all, she is unforgettable. And as her story drifts into the timeless vault of history, it remains unsettled, unresolved, echoing like a question without final answer. The quiet earth of Frogmore holds her now, beside the man who chose her above all else. The crown moved on, steady in other hands, but her shadow lingers, a reminder that even the most ancient of institutions can be shaken by the simple, inexorable pull of love. And so our tale comes to its close. The story of Wallis Simpson is not one of neat conclusions, but of ambiguities, of paradoxes, of questions left to linger like the scent of lilacs at twilight. May her memory stir reflection in you, dear listener, as you drift into rest. For history does not end with answers, but with echoes that remain in the quiet of the night.